duct tape really can fix anything, right? And the second thing that we learned from that video, and you know this, is a Boy Scout is always what? That's right. Hey, so glad you guys are here. Happy New Year. Hey, one of the invitations that I guess I would make to you as we head on into 2026 is to be in worship, to be in God's Word, because it really does make a difference in your faith, and it really does make a difference in your life. And so I just want to say thank you for starting the new year off right, and it is good to see you. So for the new year, we're kicking off a brand new series, and the title of the series is Always Be Prepared. And here's the thing about the title of that series. It is not just the Boy Scout motto, it is also a high and a holy calling. One of the most famous followers of Jesus, a guy named Peter, writes a little book in the back of the New Testament, 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, he says this, always be prepared, which is where we get the title of this series from. And Peter says, here's what I want you to always be prepared for. I want you to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that lives in you. Peter says one of the greatest gifts that a person who follows Jesus can receive is the gift of hope. And Christians really do have the gift of hope. We have hope that no matter how bad things may seem today, a better day is on its way. We have hope that no matter how far someone has fallen into sin because of what Jesus has done, they can be forgiven. And Peter would say that eventually and inevitably, somebody is going to ask you a question about that hope. In fact, more than that, someone might even press you on that hope. They may kind of interrogate you on that hope. They may accuse you of being maybe a little bit idealistic or maybe a little bit moralistic or maybe trying to make meaning out of a meaningless life and universe. And when someone asks you a question about why you believe in Jesus and why you hope in him, you need to be prepared to give an answer to them. But here's the thing. I think if we're honest with ourselves, most of us, at least in some ways, feel at least a little unprepared. And that can make us just a little bit scared because we don't feel prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks us for the hope in Jesus that we have in us. In fact, back in 2018, there's a famous Christian research organization called Barna, and they teamed up with an organization called Lutheran Hour Ministries, which is an organization that is part of our church body, and they published a book called Spiritual Conversations in the Digital Age. And they surveyed a bunch of people about how comfortable they felt sharing the hope that they have in Jesus and how prepared they felt. And here's what they found. They found that 26% of the people they surveyed were what they termed eager conversationalists. In other words, they loved talking about their faith. They felt prepared to talk about their faith, and they would look for opportunities to talk about the hope that they have in Jesus. Conversely, 74% of the people they surveyed, they found were what they called reluctant conversationalists. In other words, they didn't really want to share their faith. They would avoid and evade opportunities to share their faith, and here's why. It's because they felt unprepared. And that made them just a little bit scared. They were scared that somebody was going to ask them a question about faith that they couldn't answer. Or they were scared that if they got into a conversation about faith, the conversation could get a little bit hot and heated, and they didn't want to get into that kind of conversation. Or they were scared that maybe someone that they tried to share their faith with would accuse them of being maybe a little overly moralistic or overbearing or pushy about their faith. And so they just avoided the conversations altogether because they felt unprepared. Now, this series for the next 3 weeks is meant to, at least in part, remedy that problem. Because for the next 3 weeks in this series, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you some tools that will hopefully help you prepare for the opportunity to share the hope that lives in you when it comes to the faith that you have in Jesus Christ. And so this weekend, as we kick off this series, I'm going to give you the first of 3 tools, and I'm going to let you know right up front, okay? The first of these tools is actually the toughest of these tools. This is the tool that is most likely to make most of us squirm. So here's the deal. If I give you the tool today and you don't like the tool, come back next weekend because the tool will be better. Fair enough? All right? So here's the first tool that we need to always be prepared to share our faith in Jesus. The first tool that we need is we need the tool of courage. There is just a reality here, and I got to be honest with you up front about this. that in order to share your faith, in order to share the hope that you have in Jesus, sometimes you need to get comfortable with having some conversations that are uncomfortable. In fact, let me give you a definition of courage, and this is not a technical definition. This is just a definition that I made up, okay? Courage is that hard thing that you kind of, even if you don't want to do it, it's that hard thing that you know you have to do, even when fear is whispering in the back of your mind not to. Courage is the kind of thing that a firefighter has, right? When they go running into a burning building, it's not that they aren't scared. They're scared. It's a dangerous and dire situation, but they know there's something they have to do, even when fear is telling them not to. That is courage, and we do need courage to share our faith. Because sometimes we will be scared that someone will ask us a question that we won't be able to answer. Sometimes we will be scared that if we try to have a conversation, someone will accuse us and maybe wrongfully accuse us of being pushy or overbearing. But we need to have those conversations anyway, and that's what courage calls us to. And so today, as we kick off this series, I want to ask a very simple question in this message. Where do we get that kind of courage? Like, how can we be courageous when it comes to sharing the hope that we have in Jesus Christ? Now, to try to unravel this question, here's what I want to do. I want to walk through and work through one of the most famous stories in all the Bible. It's a story about a guy named Daniel who gets thrown into a lion's den. And here's the thing. If you grew up in church or if you've been to like Sunday school twice, my guess is you've heard this story before. I figured I'd just begin with a little mass survey. How many of you have heard the story of Daniel and the lion's den before? Okay, I think most of us in the room. So here's the thing. If you've read the story, then you know how the story ends. And here's the thing. For today's message, even if you know how the story ends, I need you to lean in. Because one of the things that we're going to discover and uncover in the story is that Daniel is a man who displays exceptional and even miraculous courage. And today, we're going to try to figure out where that courage came from. So, here's Daniel's story. It's from the pages of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, Daniel 6, beginning at verse 1. Here's Daniel's story. It pleased Darius, and already I need to pause right there and just set a little bit of context here for you. As the story opens, we got two main characters. One is Daniel, and the other is this guy named Darius. And Darius is a king who has just ascended to the throne of an empire called the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, just to kind of give you a lay of the land, here's a little map of the Medo-Persian Empire. It's outlined in green. And this is actually a conglomeration of two different empires, the Median Empire and the Persian Empire. They combined forces to form like a mega, massive super empire. And Darius has just ascended to the throne of this mega, massive super empire. Now, as Darius begins his rule and reign as the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, he does what a lot of rulers do. He hires like a bunch of government bureaucrats because he's trying to like organize his government. And so back to Daniel 6 verse 1, it pleases Darius to appoint 120 satraps. Now, a little bit more background here for you. These satraps, the word satrap is a Persian word, and it means the protector of the kingdom. And so these satraps that Darius appoints, these are guys like IRS agents and CIA agents and FBI agents and Border Patrol agents and military brass, because as Darius is getting his kingdom going, he wants to protect the kingdom from problems on the inside and threats from the outside. And so he appoints all of these protectors of the kingdom. And when you appoint that many protectors of the kingdom, you need another layer of government bureaucracy to manage all those protectors of the kingdom. And so over the 120 satraps, Darius also appoints 3 administrators, one of whom is our main character for today, Daniel. Now, the fact that Darius would appoint Daniel to be kind of a high-level government bureaucrat is a little surprising, and here's why. Daniel is a bureaucrat in the Medo-Persian Empire, but he's not Median, and he's not Persian. He's actually Jewish. He came over from his home city, the hometown of Jerusalem, 65 years earlier to live in this empire. And for 65 years, he's actually been working in some governmental capacity for this empire. And it turns out that Daniel is actually a very adept government bureaucrat. In fact, he's so good at his job that Daniel 6, verse 3, that he distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps, that when the king began to realize how good Daniel was, he figured he could use Daniel to do a little bit of government downsizing. He could get rid of some of the satraps, he could get rid of the other administrators, and he could make Daniel kind of the chief administrator, the highest administrator over the whole kingdom. But this caused a little problem with the other government bureaucrats. Verse 4, when the administrators and the satraps found out about this, they got a little worried about this because they didn't want to lose their jobs. They became a little bit jealous of Daniel, and they began to look for ways to find charges against Daniel and his conduct of government affairs. Because they figured, hey, Daniel's old hat at this. He's been in government for 65 years. And you can always dig up dirt on someone who works in government for 65 years, right? There's always some oppo research that you can find, but not with Daniel. No, this guy kept his nose perfectly clean. They could find no corruption in him. He was trustworthy. He wasn't a bit corrupt. He wasn't negligent in his duties at all. He worked hard every single day. As Mary Poppins would say, Daniel was practically perfect in every way. Now, all these other government bureaucrats, they kind of feel like they've hit a dead end here. Because they want to take Daniel down a peg or two, but they can't figure out anything they can do. And they finally say in desperation, we're never going to find any basis for any charges against this man Daniel. And then all of a sudden an idea comes to them. Unless they say, it has something to do with his God. Because here's the one thing that everybody knew about Daniel. Everyone knew that Daniel was faithful to his God as a Jew. Everyone knew that Daniel worshiped and reverenced and prayed to the God of Israel. And he wasn't going to compromise on that. And that's where they get their idea from. Verse 6, the administrators and the satraps, they actually go to King Darius. And they say to him, may King Darius live forever. Most people say, long live the king. We say, forever live the king. Because Darius, you're such a great dude. We hope you rule and reign over us forever. In fact, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, we've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, should be thrown into a lion's den. All these government bureaucrats, they go as a group to Darius, and they say to Darius, listen, we know that you're new to the throne. But boy, are you doing a great job. In fact, you're doing such a great job that you know what we need to do? We need to celebrate you. And so how about this, Darius? We are proposing that we, across the kingdom, have a 30 days of Darius celebration. We've already got the t-shirts printed. We already have the bobblehead dolls made. Everybody gets a swag bag with Darius memorabilia. In fact, Darius, you're such a good guy. You can not only rule the kingdom on a macro level, you can actually help people on a micro level. And so how about we do this too? For the next 30 days, let's just have everyone come to you with all their problems, all their concerns, all their cares, all their worries, all their anxiety. They can pray to you for the next 30 days because Darius, you're such a good guy. You will know exactly what to do. Verse 8, now your majesty, here's the thing. We know that you're very modest. And so we need you to issue this decree and put it in writing, but we know how you work, okay? We'll celebrate you for a few days and you'll go, oh, that's enough, guys, no more, no. You deserve 30 days. And so let's put it in writing in a way that it cannot be altered. Let's put it in the law of the Medes and the Persians. This is like a law that is chiseled in stone. And once you decree it, Darius, not even you can repeal it. And really, Darius, you're worth 30 days of celebration. And so after a little bit of arm twisting and cajoling, that's what Darius decides to do. He puts the decree in writing to celebrate him. Now, make no mistake about it. when all these government bureaucrats come to Darius and they propose this big 30 days of Darius plan, they know exactly what they're trying to do. And here's what they're not trying to do. They're not really trying to honor Darius. They're trying to get Daniel. Because here's what they know about Daniel, and here's especially what they know about Daniel's faith. Daniel has a law that he lives by that is chiseled in stone too. And Daniel's law says things like in Exodus 20, verse 3, Daniel's God says, "You shall have no other gods besides me." And so all these government bureaucrats know that there's no way that Daniel will be able to pray to a king named Darius this way, because to pray to Darius would be to treat Darius like a god, which is something that Daniel's own law says he cannot do. And sure enough, back to the story, Daniel 6, verse 10, when Daniel learned about the decree, what does he do? He goes home. And he goes to his upstairs room, where his windows face toward Jerusalem. Think about that. He's been in the Medo-Persian Empire for 65 years, and yet he still looks toward his home city. He still yearns for his homeland. And just like he's always done 3 times a day, he gets down on his knees and he decides to pray, giving thanks and praying to not Darius, but to his God, just like he had always done before. Now, it's at this point of the message that I need to pause and ask you, okay? If you were Daniel, what would you do? Make no mistake about it, when Daniel gets down on his knees to pray that day, he's not just on his knees, he's shaking on his knees. He knew about the decree. And he knew that his decision to pray to his God could be the thing that would cost him his life. But he did it anyway. He knew what he had to do, even when fear had to be screaming at him not to. You know what that is, right? That's courage. And so let me ask you, if you were Daniel, what would you do? Would you have that kind of courage? Well, Daniel 6, verse 11, all those government bureaucrats who went to Darius and proposed 30 days of Darius, they just happened accidentally. This wasn't on purpose at all, I promise, okay? They just happened to be passing by Daniel's house one day, and they saw that he had decided to pray, not to Darius, but to his God. He was asking his God for help. And they were filled with glee, you better believe it. And so they made a beeline back to the palace and to Darius, and they spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, they say to Darius, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king kind of blushes and he says, yeah, you cajoled me into it. The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which not even I can repeal. And then they drop their bomb on Darius. They say to him, well, we don't really know how to tell you this, sire. But you know that really good guy who was going to be like your administrative guru, the guy that you were going to use to do all the government downsizing? He was going to be like your chief in command right next to you, the chief administrator over the whole empire. You know Daniel? Well, we were just taking a walk today, and We happen to see that he had decided to pray, and he didn't pay any attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still wants to pray 3 times a day, but not to you, to his old God that he believes in as a Jew. Now, as soon as these government bureaucrats tell Darius this, Darius all of a sudden sees what they've done to him. He sees right through it. In fact, when he hears this, he falls apart. He becomes greatly distressed because he realizes 30 days of Darius, this was never about me. This was about their jealousy of Daniel. And so he gets desperate. He calls in every lawyer. He hires every attorney. He reaches out to the faculty of Harvard Law School, and he looks for some sort of loophole in the law of the Medes and the Persians, any sort of workaround. He does everything he can think of to rescue Daniel. He knows he has to enforce his decree by sundown that day, and so he talks to everybody he can think of. But there's nobody who can find a loophole. There's nobody who can discover that legal workaround. And so finally, sundown comes. And verse 16, the king has to give the order, and they have to bring Daniel and throw him into the lion's den. And when they do, they bring this big stone and they roll it over the mouth of that den that is really Daniel's tomb. Because everybody knows when he's thrown in there, his situation is not going to be changed. He's going to be dead in minutes. And the king emotionally is wrecked. Verse 18, he goes back to his palace that night. And he can't eat. And he can't sleep. In fact, he wakes up early the next morning at first light of dawn. And he goes and he does something kind of odd. He hurries back to the lion's den. And he does something that I think a lot of grieving people do. In fact, I've been a pastor for long enough that when I talk to people who've recently lost a loved one, you know what the number one wish they have is? Just one more day. One more day with that person that they care so much about. And I've been through enough grief myself, too, and you're going to get a little insight into me psychologically, that the reason that I always want one more day is because there's always something else that I kind of want to say, right? I want to say I love you one more time. Or I want to say I really care about you one more time. In fact, something that I've caught myself doing, and maybe you do this too if you've lost someone close to you, it's like you begin to talk to them like they're almost there because you really wish they were. That's what Darius does. Verse 20, he comes near the den, and he starts talking to a dead man in an anguished voice. And he talks to him about the thing that he noticed the most about him. Because the thing that Darius noticed the most about Daniel was his faithfulness to his God. And so he knows it's a worthless question, but he asks it anyway. Daniel, he says to the dead guy, has your God, whom you serve continually, has that God been able to rescue you? Now, here's what Darius knows he's going to hear. Silence. Because Daniel's dead. His body's been mauled, his spirit's gone away. But then, if you know the story, something happens that nobody, including Darius, really expects that day. Because from the den, a dead man begins to speak. And Daniel answers. And he says, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel. And that angel did something amazing. He shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, Daniel says. Because I was found to be innocent in his sight. And by the way, Daniel says to the king, I realize that I didn't pray to you, but I never meant to do any wrong before you. Praying to my God was something that I just had to do. My own law told me to. Even if my fear was screaming at me not to. And you know what that is, right? That's courage. It's exceptional, almost supernatural courage. And it's this amazing display of courage that takes us back to our question for today, which is this: where does that kind of courage come from? Anyway. How did Daniel manage to be that courageous about his faith, even though he could see that it was probably going to cost him his life? How did Daniel pull that off? Let me see if I can take a crack at answering that question. But to get there, I got to do a little historical detour with you, if you don't mind. And so just kind of follow me down a historical rabbit trail for just a second, okay? About 200 years after Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, after this story from Daniel 6, there arises this guy who actually takes over the Medo-Persian Empire. His name is Alexander. History calls him Alexander the Great. Anybody heard of Alexander the Great before? Okay. Alexander the Great was actually from Greece, and Alexander becomes basically the king of the whole world. He has the largest empire that the world has ever seen. Now, Alexander, as a Greek, wanted everybody in his empire to speak Greek. And so everybody starts speaking Greek in the empire, including Jews who were a part of his empire. Generation after generation of Jewish folks begin to speak Greek, even though this is not their ancestral language. Their ancestral language is Hebrew. In fact, almost all of the Old Testament, okay, the Jewish scriptures, what was written originally in Hebrew with like a little bit of Aramaic, which is kind of like a cousin language to Hebrew, sprinkled in here and there. Now, this began to pose a problem for the Jewish people who were living under Alexander's rule and reign, because as generation after generation of Jewish folk grew up speaking Greek, some generations and some Jews began to forget their ancestral language of Hebrew. The problem was the Old Testament scriptures were written in Hebrew, which meant that they couldn't read their own Bibles. And so, right around the year 250 BC, there's this group of 70 Hebrew scholars who are all Jewish. They get together, and here's what they do. They translate the Old Testament from the original Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek so that these Jews who speak Greek can actually read their own Bible. Now, when they do this, they call this translation the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek word. It means 70, and it's in honor of the 70 scholars who worked on this massive project to translate the Jewish Bible. And when they translate the Bible, they're very concerned about syntax and grammar and making a faithful translation. But here's what else they're concerned about. They're concerned about accurately conveying the theology of the Old Testament. And this comes out in some very interesting ways, including in the Greek translation of the Old Testament book of Daniel. Because in the ancient, this would be Aramaic, in Daniel 6, verse 22, when Daniel speaks to King Darius about his rescue, he says to King Darius, "My God, he sent his angel. And that angel was the one who shut the mouths of the lions." But when this gets translated into Greek, in the Septuagint, it changes a little bit. Daniel says to the king very simply this: God. And all of a sudden, in the Greek translation, the angel disappears. God himself was right there with me in the lion's den. God himself was the one who shut the mouths of the lions and saved me from the lions. Now, why would the translators do something like this? Are they just being irresponsible? I don't think so. Are they like trying to change the meaning of the Bible? I don't think they're doing that either. In fact, here's what they're actually trying to do. They're not trying to change the meaning of the Bible. They're trying to communicate the meaning of the Bible. You see, it turns out that if you read through the pages of the Old Testament, there's this kind of interesting figure. He's called the angel of the Lord. And he shows up all over the pages of the Old Testament. He shows up to really famous Old Testament characters, guys like Abraham. He shows up to Jacob. He shows up to King David. He shows up to Gideon, and that's only to name a few. And what you begin to realize when you read about the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is that the angel of the Lord, usually angels are messengers from God, but this isn't really a messenger from God. This is almost like an apparition of God. The angel of the Lord, when he appears, it's like God himself is showing up in a form that people can see. And that's what these translators believed happened with Daniel in the lion's den. God didn't just dispatch an angel from heaven. He himself showed up in a form that Daniel could see. And he rescued Daniel from what would have been a great tragedy. Now, this begs another question. If that's true, if it was God himself who showed up to rescue Daniel, what kind of a God would show up in a situation like that? What kind of a God would show up in a situation where a man is unjustly accused just for being faithful? What kind of a God would show up in a situation where a man is condemned to death just for being righteous? What kind of a God would show up in a situation where he is like thrown into a cave that is really just his grave, and a great stone gets rolled in front of that grave, and everyone thinks he's dead and done, but then morning dawns, and it turns out that he's alive and risen? What kind of a God would show up in a situation like that? Can you think of anybody? Let me give you another historical detour, okay? So the Old Testament nation of Israel was divided into 12 different tribes. In fact, here's a list of all 12 of the tribes. These were family groups that comprised the nation of Israel. Now, everybody, because history was kind of a big deal, kind of knew what their tribe was because they knew where they were from. They knew who their relatives were. And Daniel happened to be from the tribe of Judah, okay? That was Daniel's people. That was his tribe. Now, Daniel's a pretty famous guy from that tribe. There's an even more famous guy from that tribe. His name is Jesus. Jesus is also from the tribe of Judah. In fact, Jesus is so famously from the tribe of Judah that in the last book of the Bible, in Revelation, Jesus is given a nickname that has to do with his tribe. He's called in Revelation 5, verse 5, the Lion. The Lion of the tribe of Judah. And the Lion of the tribe of Judah, Revelation 5, verse 5, says, has triumphed. You see, at the end of the story, here's how it turns out. It turns out that the Lion of Daniel's tribe was stronger than the lions in Darius's den. And that's where Daniel's courage came from. It came from knowing that no matter what he faced or what he had to go through, his lion, his God, his Jesus was always going to be with him. And let me give you a secret. He's always going to be with you too. So this painting up here on the screens. This is my favorite painting, my favorite depiction of Daniel on the lion's den. It was painted by a British artist. His name is Bridon Riviere. He painted it way back in 1890. And I love this, just a beautiful painting. It does include a little bit of gore. If you look there on the floor, you see like some human feet, okay? Because most of the people who got thrown into the lion's den never came out, even though Daniel did. But here's my favorite part of this painting. What direction is Daniel looking? You know, it's so tempting when we look at the world to become obsessed with the lions. And there are lots of them. You can find them all over the place. There are lions in the economy, there are lions in politics, there are lions in culture, there are lions in your own family, there may be lions at work, there are lions of messed up morality, and we look around and all we can see are these lions roaring at us, but that's not what Daniel was focused on. As strong as those lions were, he had a lion from the tribe of Judah that was even greater. And even in the den, he did what he always did, and he looked up to him. He prayed to him. That's where Daniel's courage came from. Daniel got his courage from something that he believed with his whole heart was totally true. That no matter what anyone has to go through, God is always with you. He didn't get his courage from having all the answers to all the theological questions. He didn't get his courage from being the bravest guy in the bunch. He didn't get his courage from being the most educated person in the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel got his courage from simply believing and knowing that God was with him. And because of that, because of him, he could face anything. So, what would you do and how would you live if you behaved like that was actually true? Who would you be willing to talk to? Who would you be willing to be courageous with? That son or that daughter who's strayed from the faith? Maybe that neighbor who's made a mess out of their life? Maybe that person with a totally different worldview than you. Would you be willing to have a conversation with them too? You know what I love most about the story of Daniel? Daniel could have been a great professional church worker. I mean, he really could have been. He could have been a phenomenal prophet, man. He could have been as insightful as Isaiah, as eloquent as Jeremiah, as radical as Ezekiel. He could have been a great priest. He could have been someone like Aaron, who was Israel's first high priest, man. He could have gotten any job in the temple that he wanted to, but that's not what he did. He was a government bureaucrat in a pagan empire. And he changed the world. Over 2,500 years later, we're still talking about him. Because Daniel knew that no matter what it is that you do, you can be courageous just by knowing that the Lion of the tribe of Judah is with you. He's the reason for the hope that we have. And you know what? The world needs that hope. You have that hope. So, will you share it? Here's what I know about you. Not because you have all the answers and not because you're the bravest, but simply because Jesus is with you, you're totally prepared to. Because with Jesus, we can always be prepared. Let's stand and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your servant Daniel. What an amazing story. Thank you for the Lion of the tribe of Judah who showed up in that den to defeat the other lions. And thank you that because the Lion of the tribe of Judah has showed up for us on a cross and from an empty tomb, the lions of death and sin and the devil have all been defeated. And because of that, we don't need to be scared. We can simply always be prepared to give an answer for the reason for the hope that we have. We ask that we would do that by your Spirit's power, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, as you leave this place and as the service concludes, go knowing that the Lion of the tribe of Judah is with you, and because he is, you're blessed. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you his peace. Now, take that hope that lives in you, share it with the world, and when you do, you will shine like stars in the universe as you hold out God's word of life. Amen.